Somebody save me from this TikTok nightmare. You'll have to wait to the end to get to the real bombshell. Cannot say the word conscientious. Conscientious. I cannot say that. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Sam. In my last few videos, you've seen me spend a lot of time in the TikTok rabbit hole. Well, things have not gotten better. I stumbled across a few of our TikTok friends talking about an experiment, namely the Minnesota Starvation Experiment.
Don't bring up the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. Don't bring up the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. Don't bring up the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. Don't bring up the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. Hey, have you heard about the Minnesota Starvation Experiment?
Now, originally this video concept was me wanting to talk about the theories of starvation mode, where they claim that it's hard to lose weight when you're restricting calories because your body will go into starvation mode and think there's a famine and immediately try to hold on to your body fat.
Because the second I start ignoring my body's cues, it's over. The instant my body tells me it is hungry and I choose either not to feed it or to underfeed it, which is what a calorie deficit is, it knows it's time for famine. It goes into scarcity mode. It thinks I don't have access to food, and as a result, my body turns on all the alarms to try to get me to eat as much as humanly possible so that I can survive this famine.
When they talk about starvation mode is when they tend to bring this experiment up the most, where at the University of Minnesota in 1944, they starved men. And then they like to relay a lot of misinformation about how that experiment broke the calories in versus calories out sort of mentality. And honestly, it's like a wild game of telephone out there. It is almost completely misinformation that's being shared. And so I wanted to talk about this experiment today to sort of put the whole thing in context and try to, just clear up some of that misinformation, because there is a lot of it. So I'm going to focus a lot of my review on one TikToker in particular whose name is Sparkle Jam. Sparkle Jams is dramatic. There's really no other way to say it. Their TikToks include putting on makeup or playing really dramatic music, over dramatizing what they're saying by lowering their voice like this and telling you that they know what's good for you. And I may just throw in a few other clips that I thought were just cuckoo banana pants. So let's get into it. So the first tip off for me that these TikTokers have no clue what they're talking about and are spreading misinformation is the fact that they couldn't even tell me the basics of the experiment without tripping over themselves or saying the wrong amount of time. I'll show you here.
During an 11-month period, the men went from first eating 3,200 calories a day to eating 1,570 calories. Notably, more calories than many modern weight loss programs allow.
I can absolutely explain the Minnesota Starvation Experiment and why weight loss is not as simple as calories in, calories out. This experiment took place in 1944 and 1945 and involved 36 men who were studied for a period of 12 weeks, eating a baseline diet of 3,200 calories a day. Then they went through a 24-week period where they ate between 1,300 and 1,600 calories a day. They lost 25% of their body weight, and then they went through a recovery period where they ate thousands of calories at every meal in order to regain that weight and study the effects of starvation and how to best help people recover from famine.
So as you can see, each of them has a different description of how long the experiment was. Even Sparkle Jams says 11 months, but then types 14 months in their text, but then says it's a whole mess. So that was my first tip off, that maybe people don't actually know what they're talking about. You can also see it by the difference in calories. Every single person who talks about the Minnesota Starvation Experiment gives a different number of calories that they were eating once the semi-starvation period started. So we can see some of them saying it was 1,300 calories, some of them saying it was 1,500 calories. I have found articles saying it was 1,800 calories. So it seems like they're just sort of making it up as they go along, and no one really knows how many calories they were actually put on. I will also just add here that I could not find the primary source material for this, which is The Biology of Human Starvation by Ancel Keys, without having to pay $75 for it. It's also 575 pages. It's an insanely long book, which let me know immediately that my TikTok friends were likely not referring to primary sources when they were spewing this information. That said, the best secondary source that I found let me know that the experiment took place between November of 1944 and October of 1945. So it was an 11-month period. And during the control period, the men were eating 3,200 calories per day. And then during the semi-starvation period, which lasted 6 months, they were dropped to 1,800 calories per day. Now, the calorie counts did actually range because, again, they were being very scientific about this, and they were measuring each specific man's needs. So based on their height and things of that nature, they needed to have some calorie adjustments in there. They weren't all fed the exact same diet. And before we get to how wrong our TikTok friends are about the results of the experiment and what happened to the men during the experiment, I just want to add that they always conveniently leave out that not only were the men's diets calorie counts cut in half, the men were still required to take college classes. They also had to work out and walk at least 22 miles per week, in addition to their normal housekeeping duties of the laboratory. So there were other things going on. They weren't just laying around like lazy slugs and eating 1,800 calories while being studied. There was another whole portion to this. And the reason for that has to do with the historical context of this experiment. So the years 1944 and 1945 are significant in history because World War II was still happening. Actually, around the time that the study began, they were starting to see concentration camps closing, and when concentration camps were closing, the Germans were, if they weren't killing everyone in the camp, they were putting them on these really long walks from one camp to another, and we know that people died along the way. So we were starting to see these severely starved and emaciated bodies along these trails. We were seeing them in the countries that had been occupied by prisoners of war. People were severely emaciated, they were starving, and we needed to know how to treat them. So the purpose of Ancel Keys was to figure out how relief workers could best take care of these people. Because until this point, while famines had certainly happened, they weren't seeing it on this scale. Because not only were the prisoners of war and the people residing in concentration camps being starved by the Germans, war just destroys everything. It destroyed any food transportation. It was destroying crops and fields. So we were seeing worldwide famine at the same time. Now I want to also share, it was important for relief workers to have this information because there are so many stories in history. And in the primary source preview that I could find, they were talking about that. So in Switzerland, some concentration camp survivors made it out, they escaped, and even though they were in a hospital, I think it was 55 of them, half of them died, even though they were in proper hospital care, because their bodies just couldn't handle the refeed process. There are also firsthand accounts of soldiers, Allied soldiers, who were seeing these emaciated bodies coming out of the camps and sharing their rations and trying to just really, do the best that they could without realizing that they were actively hurting these people who had been starving for years at this point. And so giving them more food and allowing them to gorge themselves actually killed some of the prisoners who had managed to survive until that point. And again, it's not something that they wanted to do. It's extremely sad, but that is what made this research so beneficial at the time. Okay, now that all of my historical mumbo jumbo is out of the way, let's look at some clips of these TikTokers talking about the effects of semi-starvation on the men, and then trying to relate it to what it means today. Brace yourselves.
The men of the Minnesota Starvation Experiment who were previously happy and politically passionate when restricted to 1,500 calories a day became irritable, fatigued, depressed, and politically apathetic. The men became obsessed with food, dreaming and fantasizing about it. They began saving and sneaking food. Some developed bulimia, some developed body dysmorphia, thinking they were fat when they were obviously emaciated. During the unrestricted rehabilitation period, when the men were finally allowed to eat as much as they wanted, they developed a primal hunger, engaging in extreme overeating, often until they made themselves sick. They developed a scarcity mentality and binged frequently. It took an average of 5 months for each of them to return to normal eating patterns.
Interestingly, during the period of caloric restriction, there were 2 or 3 men who ended up not being able to stick to the diet and were removed from the study because they couldn't adhere to the low-calorie intake. There was one person who also ate the same diet but did not lose the 25% body weight and so was also removed from the study. During the caloric restriction, the men became obsessed with food. They would talk about it, dream about it, describe it in extreme detail, the smells and the tastes. And when they were eating, they became physically aggressive and protective of their physical plate. They would spend that time with disordered eating behaviors, things like chopping it up into little tiny pieces to extend the meal and make it last longer. They were observed digging through the trash, and they were very concerned with food waste and not allowing anyone to throw anything away. During the same time, the men were reporting feelings of depression, isolation. They reported low sex drive, hair loss, headaches, gastrointestinal upset. Some men experienced psychosis that carried over into the recovery period.
Did anyone else ever play that Flash game that was on like addictinggames.com where you like offed your boss because they were annoying you, but at the beginning of the game he would walk in and say, wrong, wrong, wrong. That's how I feel right now. All of this is wrong. Most of this is just incorrect. It is just insanely misinformative about what this whole experiment was. I'm going to try to keep it concise, but I'll be honest, my thoughts are a little bit all over the place here. So one of the first things that really got me is when they described the rehabilitation period as a period where the men could just eat whatever they wanted. That is absolutely not true. The rehabilitation period was still a controlled portion of the study where the men were divided into subcategories and they were given different calorie counts to increase their food intake and their protein intake so that they could figure out in the study how many calories and how much protein was necessary to help these people build back their lean muscle mass that they had lost and body tissue that they had lost. In the primary source documentation, while they were studying men, they do discuss a prior study that was done with women who had survived a camp, and they talk about the effects of starvation, shrinking ovaries, and things of that nature. So they're really trying to figure out, in order to help these men grow their muscles back and get their acuity back up, how many calories do we need to give them? What do they need to recover the body mass that they've lost over these 6 months? So no, they weren't just given full access to eat whatever they wanted. Also, I just laughed out loud when the blue-haired lesbian said that one man was kicked out of the study because he followed the diet but wasn't losing the proper amount of weight. And to that I say, bullshit. He was sneaking food, and the researchers realized, because they still had access to the outside world, that he was not sticking to the diet the same way that the other men were, and so he was removed from the study. So again, you can see the little fat acceptance talking points being built in. You know, sometimes we'll see their comments where they're like, but I've tried every diet and I was eating 1,800 calories and I still gained weight. It's not possible. And the study literally said that, and they literally kicked somebody out because of it. So no, it doesn't work as a talking point for why calories in, calories out doesn't work. And a lot of the side effects that they mention, I think were to be expected by us now because we know so many things, but to the researchers, it may have been more surprising. But loss of hair from lack of nutrition is not new to us. Psychosis, depression, being cold, having lower circulation, those things are not new to us now. But they were certainly newer when the research was being conducted. The food aggression, dreaming about food, your body craving food. Again, those things today, based on studies, are not abnormal to us because if you have a deficiency, then your body will alert you. It will crave something as a way of alerting you of like, hey, you're not getting this. Actually, in the comment section of someone else's video here on YouTube, if this person follows me, please leave a comment below, but they were talking about how they just suddenly started craving eggs, and they were never a person who ate a whole bunch of eggs, but they went to the doctor and they were like, wow, your cholesterol is really low. And we all know that eggs have a lot of cholesterol. So again, your body does these things. It's almost like bodies are smart or something. Now, another point of contention is that one of the participants did conduct some self-mutilation. I couldn't find that again in the primary source documentation. I was not about to pay $75 for a book. But one of our TikTokers says that he chopped off 3 fingers with an axe. Another says that he cut off his whole hand. Some secondary sources I found online said that he was working on a car and dropped the brake rotor on his fingers, like by taking the car off the jack, which amputated his fingers. So nobody really knows, and I think it's enough to say that yes, it happened. And again, psychosis was a part of this whole thing. I think the fact that they're trying to use the psychosis in comparison to today, if you put yourself on a diet, you could go through this and chop your own fingers off, is just asinine. So I just wanted to drop that in here because nobody really knows what happened, and without actually looking at that primary documentation, no one ever will. So maybe at some point I will, but for now, we're just gonna go with some self-mutilation happened, but you're not connecting the dots in the right way. I'll also add Sparkle Jam in her 3-part TikToks talking about the Minnesota Starvation Experiment actually mentions a follow-up study that happened in 2018. Now, I want to be clear. This was not a follow-up study. This was an oral history project, which is very different than a scientific study. Essentially, an oral history project will go door to door, make phone calls, in this day and age do Zoom calls with people who have survived an event or an experience, or in this case, this experiment, who are still alive, and capture their memory of being a part of the experiment. Now, oral histories are extremely valuable to us. It is the basis for a lot of history, especially regarding American slavery, especially regarding genocide survivors, especially regarding survivors of concentration camps and prisoners of war. Basically any historical event, if you can get a first-person source, that is fantastic. But oral histories are not without issues because they're based upon memory. And memory, as we all know, is such a fickle thing because you think you remember one way and maybe it happened another way. You've had your whole life to kind of build this story over and over and over again. And you could be solidifying something in your own memory that didn't actually happen that way. So historians know that when you're using an oral history or taking an oral history, like you have to be really, really careful about the way you relay that information. For example, there are a number of oral histories coming out of concentration camps where survivors remembered seeing Dr. Mengele, but there's actual documentation of his travels and where he was to say that he was not there. So again, you just have to make sure that you're backing up anything you're saying from an oral history. Now, interestingly enough, all of that said, Sparkle Jams still misquoted this entire oral history project. So I'm going to show the misquotes and then tell you what actually happened. So here we can see she's saying that they maintained a higher body weight throughout their lives. According to the study that she's quoting, during the control period, the mean BMI of the 32 participants who completed the experiment was 21.9, and the range was 18.4 through 25.4. At the end of the semi-starvation period, the 32 men remaining in the study had reached the goal of 25% weight loss to a mean BMI of 16.4 and a range of 14.9 through 18.6. After 12 weeks of controlled refeeding, the mean BMI of Key's participants was 18.4, which was well below their control weights. After a few weeks of the men eating higher calorie, caloric intake seemed to level off at a more reasonable amount of 32 to 4,500 calories per day, although some continued to eat much more. And their table 2 indicates that weights were highest at week 33 with a mean BMI of 23.6 and a range of 19.6 to 29.2. By BMI parameters, 5 participants were overweight at this time with a BMI of 25 to 30, but none were considered obese. Now, another interesting point that they found that could be easy for fat acceptance to sort of skew is that the researchers did find that body fat percentages were quicker to rise than were the lean muscle mass. So they did have swinging fluctuations in body fat percentages. And by the end of the refeed period and the rehabilitation period, they were seeing higher body fat percentages in the men than when they went on the starvation diet. Now, there's no proof that they held higher body weights throughout their lifetime, and most of them went on to live happy, productive lives, most of them traveling overseas, lots of them becoming sort of social workers in this field. A few of them went on to write books, but none of that means that the men were overweight for their entire lives. It means that the body was quicker to bring back body fat, so storing those calories as body fat, than it was storing those excess calories as lean muscle mass or helping them grow back their muscle tissue that they had lost during the experiment. So I just want to be clear there, because they could easily twist that into a talking point. But again, there's nothing there, so it would not hold up. She also says that it took them years to return to normal eating patterns. And again, she misquotes the study that she brings up from 2018, which says that the food leveled off for them after about 2 weeks of the rehabilitation period. So each of them had a few weeks where they were just going crazy eating food because, again, their bodies have nutritional deficits that they're trying to fill. The longest it took one of them to fix their eating patterns were 3 years. But he was still able to fix his normal eating patterns, live a normal life at a normal body weight. So, again, misinformation. Now, at the end of her clip, she threw in a little statement where she talks about diets today and how they require calories lower than the 1800 semi-starvation diet that the men were on. Once again, failing to mention that not only were they on this diet, they were doing rigorous exercise, continuing their classes, and living whole lives. But there was one statement in particular that caught my attention, and it's when she said, "When you pursue starvation, you will gain weight and it will affect your body."
From the Minnesota Starvation Experiment and on, study after study has shown us that when food is restricted, when starvation is pursued, it does not result in sustainable long-term weight loss.
This statement was just baffling to me because the equating of an obese person going on a 1,200 calorie diet for an hour, a day, a half a day, is not the same as someone who is actually starving themselves. And even people who do starve themselves successfully without treatment don't survive. So, of course, we know that it doesn't lead to anything long term. I also understand that the messaging always needs to be that no one should be pursuing starvation tactics. And there are a lot of fad diets that do just that, like the apple diet. Water fasting has become really popular again, which is basically denying yourself all food. So I understand the basis of the statement, but it's so broad and it's so sweeping and it's so generalized. It's so sensationalized that people who were never at risk of starving now are running the opposite direction and overeating themselves into an awful quality of life. So I just want to throw that out there. I hate these little moments where I have to get overly serious, but it's just so dangerous to throw these broad statements out to people who may never see you again. I mean, Sparkle Jams herself is not very regular on TikTok. So you're seeing this one person saying this, and then other people will come behind and back it up because they've heard this misinformation. And then it becomes a talking point that sticks with people, particularly young people who may not be confident in themselves, may not know who they are, may not know how to call out this bullshit, because what it leads to are TikTokers like this.
Hey guys, Dustin Holston here, nutritionist, coach, and trainer, to talk about starvation mode and why it's real. It's real. It's been proven. So, the experiment that I like the most is the Minnesota Starvation Experiment from the 1940s. University of Minnesota starved 30 young men to see the effects of starvation on soldiers when it comes to World War II fighting for our freedom. And over the course of several months, they lost weight, but they didn't lose as much weight as they thought. And it actually busted the calories in, calories out formula. But why? Well, during the course of the study, their core body temperature went down to 97 degrees. Their respiration and their pulse went down tremendously. Their brain capacity, their mental acuity went down. They developed psychosis. One kid cut off his hand, and this is a true story. You can look it up. Why? Because the body wants to conserve energy. It actually offsets the metabolism based off the calories you eat. So starvation mode is real. It will reduce your metabolism and will cause lasting damage.
This was so hard for me to watch because this is the end of that game of telephone. This guy is so far off the mark, and the lady in the clip is just agreeing with him. And that, I think, proves my entire point. Is that things can go off the rails very quickly if we're not careful about how we're sharing the information. And there are a few things that I find particularly interesting because Fat Acceptance is the group that is bolstering this research. So the lead researcher, Ansel Keys, is well known for popularizing the BMI, which is something that Fat Acceptance people hate. So why are they in love with this research? He's also well known for the Mediterranean diet, and he really popularized that as well. So again, if we're rioting against diet culture, we're really supporting one of its icons. Who knows what we're doing? Last, but certainly not least, probably most importantly to me, not even buried in this research, in the first few pages, in the foreword of this book, here he is saying, "It is interesting that the obese man or woman can be placed on a diet as low as 600 or even 400 calories without loss of body nitrogen or other ill effects and without depression of the basal metabolic rate. In these respects, obese persons and persons of normal weight differ strikingly in their response to a low intake of calories." So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Even the research that they are touting tells them that they could go on a low-calorie diet and it wouldn't put them in starvation mode. I just can't with the nonsense today. So there you have it. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. Bye.